Hey everyone, Scott from Dearly Departed here. Today's vlog that I'm releasing is about the LaBiancas, Mr. and Mrs. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. Now, a lot's been written about the LaBiancas and their deaths and their methods of death and their details, gory details of their death. And I'm not going to say that doesn't interest me, but you know, we all know. So I figured what I'd do is put together a video of the locations having to do with their lives, the things they did before they died, the things they did the night they died, and some of the information about what happened after they died, their funeral arrangements. So that's what this is all about, where the LaBiancas lived, where they worked, and of course where they died, and where they ended up afterwards. And funny enough, Ronnie Howard figures into this story too, who was the second prisoner that Susan Atkins confessed to. So sit back and relax and enjoy a couple of minutes of the LaBiancas' lives. This is behind the old Derby, Los Feliz Brown Derby. Now, there were several Brown Derby restaurants around Los Angeles. The famous one that was shaped like a hat, that was on Wilshire. The one where all the movie stars went, that was on Hollywood and Vine. One of the lesser known ones is here in Los Feliz. Now, it's still a restaurant on that half. It's now a bank on this half, but it used to be a bar. And in this bar is where Keanu Reeves were drinking in the movie Speed. And Dolly and Lily and Jane in 9 to 5 were drinking in this bar. Now it's a bank. But the other half of it is still a restaurant today. And now it's called Mess Hall. This sign did say Derby at one point in the 90s. It's got a distinctive sort of curved roof. But here's the part that remains a restaurant. Now this was a drive-in actually, and Rosemary LaBianca used to be a car hop here. You can see how it still has a sort of kidney-shaped roof on it, where cars would pull up. This is all very nice. So the cars would pull up. Actually, these were the old parking spaces, and you can see I found a pack of matches, Brown Derby matches, that mention all the addresses, and this one does say Los Feliz at Hillhurst, and that's what this is. And this is where Mrs. LaBianca met her first husband, Frank Struther.
Back up well.
Thank you.
Tell me when you're
No, it's
ready.
okay. I appreciate that. Thank you. You're very kind. The Los Feliz Inn on Hillhurst, serving you for over a third of a century. Pierre's Los Feliz, and it changed names a couple of times, but the address is 2138 Hillhurst Avenue, a whisper south of Los Feliz Boulevard. Now, I'm not sure when it actually closed down, the Los Feliz Inn, but now in its place is a Starbucks. The Los Feliz Inn was a gorgeous, like one of those red leather, thick, old, sort of like a steakhouse almost lounge. And Mrs. LaBianca was a waitress here when she met Mr. LaBianca in 1959, roughly. (2138) Hillhurst. I like the old address better. Remember when supermarkets used to give out dictionaries and encyclopedias? Here's the Webster's Dictionary, available at the gateway markets. Mrs. LaBianca also had her shop in there. This is Bowler Hardware at 2505 Hyperion. This is where the LaBiancas had an account. This hardware store has been here since 1959. And I know they had an account here because when their estate was being settled in January of 1970, there was a claim on the estate for $28.20 that was honored by the family and paid out to Ballard. Now, I spoke to someone who worked here not that long ago, and he told me that Squeaky, Lynette Fromm, bought some rope from that hardware store, and that Vincent Bugliosi visited the hardware store when they were doing the investigation, and he was doing the background and spoke to this salesperson and Bugliosi was very, very curious as to what type of rope it was that they sold Squeaky for obvious reasons, but the particular type of rope that she bought here was had color strands in it, and it didn't match. But and then the man said that he asked her out, and she said no. So Ballard Hardware on Hyperion. Here we are at 4616 North Greenwood Place, and this is the home where Mrs. LaBianca's daughter Susan lived with her boyfriend Joe Dorgan. And on the late in the night of August 9th, Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca came back from Lake Isabella. Mr. LaBianca was driving a 1968 Green Thunderbird. They had their boat hitched up behind him. Susan was in the back, and they dropped off Susan here at her boyfriend's house. That's just at the apartment she shared with Joe Dorgan, and then drove off to their own home. If this place looks familiar to you, maybe you watched Melrose Place, because in the 80s, this was Melrose Place. After they dropped off Susan at her apartment, they stopped and bought a newspaper. So I think they made this right-hand turn here and made a U-ey and stopped where that Bank of America is now, because that's where the newspaper stand was. And Mr. LaBianca often stopped at that newspaper stand to get a newspaper because he bet on the horses every day. And so that night on their way home, after 1 a.m., they stopped and bought the Sunday paper announcing the murders of Sharon Tate and the others in Benedict Canyon. So Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca were informed of the Tate murders on their way home the next evening. They hadn't been listening to the news at all on the radio all day long, so it's the first they'd heard of it. Mr. Fokianos, who sold them the newspaper, was the last person to see the LaBiancas alive, aside from their killers. And from this point, they drove to the house on Waverly. So this is the road that the LaBiancas traveled that night. So they had just heard about the Tate murders. They were heading home. They were going to be killed in probably less than an hour. So while they were on this very route that we're on right now, they would have been discussing the very thing that was going to be happening to them in a very short period of time, in a matter of minutes. So when the LaBiancas were heading home, I think they would have gone up this road. There's the reservoir on our right, which is very lovely, very sort of Gilligan's Island, the way they've done it. And in order to park their car, because normally, as I understand it, Mr. LaBianca would park or drop the boat off or back the boat up the driveway, and it was just too late to do that. So instead of doing that, they were going to do it in the morning. this way. Waverly Drive. Their house is actually behind those hedges. So, in order to park properly with the boat, they parked right over here where this car is now. Right here. I'll get out now. This is where Mr. LaBianca parked that night. The Thunderbird with the boat hitched up behind it. And they walked, after they parked, they walked up to the driveway. The LaBiancas were killed and left here. An entire day had passed, and Frank Jr. was dropped off at about 8:30 p.m. the next evening. And he walked up the driveway. He noticed that the lights were off and the shades were drawn, which was unusual. And he knocked and called out, and no one answered. And instead of going in, he walked down to a burger joint and called his sister. This restaurant is called Mixto. In 1969, it was a burger joint called the Char Burger. It used to be a hot dog joint called the Hot Diggity Dog, but it was the Char Burger in 1969. And when Frank Jr. was disturbed by not seeing much going on at his parents' house, at his mother and stepfather's house, instead of going in and letting himself in, he stopped here, or walked down here, to use the payphone to call his sister Susan at work. And this is where I believe the payphone was. The Tam and the Great Scott are both versions of the same restaurant, and it stands now as the Tam O'Shanter. So, but this was, it was called the Great Scott in 1969, according to the telephone book of 1969. The Great Scott, 2980 Los Feliz Boulevard, 664-0228. This is where Susan Struthers LaBerge was working in 1969. So when Frank got to the house, didn't like what he felt, went to the burger joint to call his sister, here at the Tam O'Shanter. The manager of the Tam O'Shanter, or the Tam, or the Great Scott, took his information down of the payphone at the burger joint, called Susan at her apartment that we saw earlier to let her know that's where Frank was. She uses the telephone number there to the burger joint, talks to Frank, tells her what's up. Her and Joe Dorgan pick up Frank at the burger joint, and they head back to the house and found the bodies. Does that make sense to you? That's pretty complicated, but that's the way it is. So when the bodies were discovered, Frank, Joe, and Susan ran screaming down the driveway towards us, across the street, and up this driveway. And got into an apartment and called the police. The first apartment they got to called the police and said, "I've got crazy kids out in front." So they went to the second apartment, who then called the police properly. Okay, now we're at, obviously, Calvary Mortuary, and we're heading to the chapel here. I love when they're 3D like that. I hope they're lit at nighttime. I know Ramon Navarro is over there by that gray mausoleum. real wildlife in the cemetery. There's a coyote. This is the chapel in the cemetery, Calvary Cemetery. Little mausoleums for the A-listers. Well, actually, these are the B-listers. The A-listers are inside. Costello. So this is the chapel where Mr. LaBianca's funeral was held. And this is from Alice LaBianca's book, No More Tomorrows. She was the first wife of Mr. LaBianca. She wrote, they had to face arrangements for Leno's funeral. Susan, Rosemary's daughter, had insisted that Rosemary wanted to be cremated, but Leno's mother and I wanted to have a Catholic funeral for Leno, interring him at Calvary Cemetery, close to where his father was. The children acquiesced. We had a joint Catholic rosary for Leno and Rosemary on Friday night, and the chapel filled to overflowing with many outside who couldn't get in. The first Mrs. LaBianca joined Leno's family along with the children, as if I had always been a part of them, had never left to wander in a foreign land. I thought I had shed all the tears that were in me Friday night, but Saturday morning with the service in the mausoleum, I was devastated. The children sat with Leno's family, and I was left alone behind them. How I managed to make it walking alone down the long stairway to the crypt, which was outside in a separate building, I'll never know. I sat next to the children as friends and relatives streamed by to give their condolences. Remembering Wuthering Heights again, I silently pleaded to the lifeless body that lay in the closed casket, do not leave me in this world of darkness without you. I cannot live without my life. I cannot die without my soul. Here we are at Oddfellows Cemetery on Whittier Boulevard. Now, Mrs. LaBianca was cremated at Oddfellows, although her ashes were scattered. And here's the crematory of Oddfellows. People often wonder why Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca weren't buried together. But according to Alice LaBianca, Susan Struthers LaBerge wanted her mother cremated straight away. So within Oddfellows Cemetery is this little triangular area, which is all cremains. And Veronica Lopez, who is Ronnie Howard, who was, along with Virginia Graham, the informant that testified at the trial that Susan Atkins confessed to, was cremated when she died in 1979 here at Oddfellows. And that's where we are. And her ashes were inurned, buried in this area. Here she is. Ronnie Howard. And this is Oddfellows. I'd like to thank some of the people who've been supporting this page through the Patreon subscription below. Taylor Johnson, Tracy Kinter, Kieran Bow, James Harrington, Chris Murphy, Kat Vega, Melissa Webb, Randy Montgomery, Faye, Tony Burke, Ann Meyer, Nancy and Ron K., the Dead Souls Social Club, Martin Kutzler, Anne-Marie Callahan, Matthew Henriksen, Amy Hazucha, Lee Baraclow, Nicole Paneros, and Janet Dubner. If I haven't thanked you yet, I promise you I will. I appreciate your support, and there are new videos coming.